Leading up to the 7 Years' War, Europe was an unstable place, loaded with wars and rivalries, both between European powers and their overseas empires. There was a general disinterest in establishing prolonged peace. Instead, developing national interest and preparing for the next set of wars was the goal. In this regard, the 7 Years' War changed little about the way wars were fought and the amount of rivalries in Europe. However, the war, waged primarily by Britain, France, Prussia, and Austria, and to some degree Spain, did represent a turning point in Europe. It shifted alliances, reassigned territory, and brought certain powers to supremacy. The war was waged mainly over territory and land. Two of the conflicts leading up to the war represented these motivations. First, the War of Jenkins' Ear, and second, the War of Austrian Succession. The War of Jenkins' Ear was waged in 1739 between two of the major powers involved in the 7 Years' War, Spain and Britain, over a trading monopoly in the West Indies. It was a minor event, but it was part of the overarching rivalry between these two powers and the series of conflicts that later led into the Greater War. Closely following the War of Jenkins' Ear was the War of Austrian Succession. In 1740, Frederick II, King of Prussia, seized the province of Silesia from Austria. This upset the power that the Habsburgs had been holding for quite some time. More importantly, it set off a chain of alliances and an overlapping of several conflicts going on at that time. France had already been somewhat involved in the British-Spanish conflict. It had supported Spain against Britain in the New World and was planning a naval attack on Britain. Instead of the naval attack, however, French aristocrats pushed France to support the Prussian aggression against Austria during the War of Austrian Succession. This French move also brought Britain into the continental war between Prussia and Austria. Britain was eager to keep the Low Countries in the hands of Austria, its longtime ally. However, it would later become apparent that this alliance was not built to last. The War of Austrian Succession ended in the favor of Prussia with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. To the disdain of Maria Theresa, the ruler of Austria and the Habsburg dominions, Prussia kept Silesia. But the turmoil in Europe was far from over. Former alliances crumbled 8 years later, starting with the Convention of Westminster in 1756. This convention was designed to prevent the entry of foreign troops into German states. The Treaty of Westminster was signed by Britain, Austria's ally, and Prussia, Austria's enemy. That same year, France and Austria also signed a defensive alliance in response to the Convention of Westminster. These events are referred to as the Diplomatic Revolution because they rewrote alliances between these major powers. Finally, this brings us to the 7 Years' War.
The war began when Frederick the Great, fearing a conspiracy between Saxony, Austria, and France, invaded Saxony. In 1756, France and Austria made a new alliance aiming to destroy Prussia, which was later joined by Sweden, Russia, and smaller German states. But the coalition against Prussia was weak and divisive. Russians were mostly concerned with East Prussia, Austria with Silesia, and the French were preoccupied with the colonial conflict with Britain in the New World. There, the main issue was trade. Britain wanted to extend its territory westward to establish more settlements and bring more wealth into Britain. In doing this, they infringed upon French territory, which is important to its empire because of fur trapping and trade opportunities. The French also feared that the English would continue to go after French colonies, in particular the valuable sugar colonies in the Caribbean. William Pitt, who was the British Secretary of State in charge of war, funneled financial aid towards Prussia to draw France away from the colonial struggle. The British enjoyed many victories, while the French military suffered under the division and corruption in its administration, as well as its lack of resources from its earlier support of Spain in the New World. Britain achieved a decisive victory against French Indian allies in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey, and finally defeated France in 1759. Meanwhile, the new Russian Tsar, Peter III, made peace with Prussia and ended the continental conflict between it and Austria with the Treaty of Hubertusburg in 1763. This treaty resulted in no real changes to borders, but Prussia kept Silesia. The same year, William Pitt was replaced by the Earl of Bute, who was responsible for the peace settlement that ended the conflict between Britain and France, the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Britain got all of Canada, the Ohio River Valley, and the eastern half of the Mississippi River Valley, as well as the islands of Grenada, St. Vincent, Dominica, and Tobago.
Some historians argue that it was the 7 Years' War that was the First World War. It was fought both on land and at sea. In Europe, the continental US, the Caribbean Sea, the coast of West Africa, India, and the West Indies. Like in future world wars, the war resulted in huge worldwide casualties. Estimates range between 900,000 to 1.4 million. All sides suffered, but some definitely came out of the struggle better than the others. Prussia, for example, was heavily stricken by the war. However, it surprisingly persevered, which was significant to its growth as a major power. It had also managed to weaken Habsburg power. After seizure of Silesia during the War of Austrian Succession, Maria Theresa granted new privileges to the Hungarian nobility, promising them local autonomy to win their support. This resulted in Habsburg power becoming very dependent upon Hungary after the war. If anybody could be considered a winner in the 7 Years' War, it was Britain. Its victory at the Battle of Plassey gave it control over the trade in Bengal. This would eventually lead to commercial conquest of India by the British East India Company. Britain's income from the sale of sugar also increased after gaining key sugar islands in the West Indies. France, meanwhile, was weakening as a colonial power, and was in great need of political and administrative reform. Britain had excluded it from trade in Bengal, and made it lose control not only over several of its territories, but also over the sugar and slave trade. But not everything turned out perfect for Britain. Like most countries after the war, it sought to fund its war debt. One way it did this was by heavily enforcing taxes upon its North American colonies. In addition to this, it also enforced a post-treaty frontier policy, the Proclamation of 1763, that limited colonist settlement to the west. These changes caused hostility between Britain and its colonies to increase, and make many historians see the 7 Years' War and the Treaty of Paris as the start of the American Revolution. While one aspect of the British Empire was strengthened, another was beginning to crumble, just like certain powers' control, wealth, and alliances that existed before the 7 Years' War.